friends and neighbors. Thanks for coming back to my channel. This is me, Stella Hendricks, and this is part 3 of the Dorothy Stratten story from the May 1981 Playboy. We're just going to pick up right where we left off, and this is way longer than I thought it was originally, which is totally fine, but I'm going to read for 45 minutes, and then we're going to cut it off, and this might have a part 4. We're going to find out. So, Spider was suspicious from the beginning. He couldn't imagine Dorothy functioning independently, so he assumed someone else must be manipulating her. She was working 12 hours a day because Bogdanovich was pushing to stay on a tight production schedule. She was dieting strenuously, which gave her headaches, and returning each night to her room at the Wyndham Hotel to study her lines. Spider called her in the middle of the night to vent his displeasure at her absence, to threaten and cajole, and especially to complain that he needed money. He worried as much about his worsening financial position as he did about the prospect of losing Dorothy's affection, almost like they were the same thing. He appeared almost daily at the Union Bank in Century City to check on the deposits and withdrawals in Dorothy's corporate trust accounts. Once, he showed up with a brunette girlfriend and tried to convince the teller that she was Dorothy Stratten. He wanted to cash a check for $2,000 on the corporate account. When the teller refused to honor the check, Spider stomped out of the bank in a rage. He called Bob Houston one afternoon with the news that Dorothy had changed her mind and wanted him to have half the stock and become an officer in the corporation and a signer on the corporate bank account. "What the hell, Bob?" he shouted at Houston in feigned anger. "You're managing both of us, not just Dorothy. What the hell?" Another day, he walked into the office and announced, "Bob, we've got to do it. This is the way it's got to be. We're partners in this thing. She'll share 50% in my income and I'll share 50% in hers." Houston called Dorothy in New York to talk it over. "I just can't believe two people can fight so hard over business matters and still maintain a romantic relationship," he said along the way. "Bob," Dorothy told him sadly, "there hasn't been a romantic relationship between Spider and me in over a year." Exactly when Dorothy's relationship with PDB began to be more professional is unclear. Bogdanovich has been understandably reluctant to discuss the matter since her death. Oh, but don't you worry, dear readers, or dear listeners, because he wrote a whole ass book called The Killing of the Unicorn, some of which I really love, some of which I really despise, and in which he goes on to paint himself as the world's most slut-shaming feminist who ever lived, and how Dorothy agreed with him in everything and she was the perfect woman, and like it's just the most obvious self-aggrandizing bullshit in the entire universe. But I think it does give a couple legitimate glimpses into Dorothy's life, so maybe we'll cover that book on this channel at some point. But it's really interesting, Killing of the Unicorn by P.D. Bogdanovich. In my opinion, you know what? I don't know how much I can say on here. I'm gonna get myself in trouble, but in my opinion, he is the scum of the earth. Love, Stella. Okay. They may have been interested in each other before New York. Dorothy's refusal to allow Spider to accompany her there suggests that they were, but her lifelong preference for single relationships strongly suggests a later flaring of the romance with Peter in New York during the filming of They All Laughed, after her marriage to Spider had deteriorated beyond repair. Scratchy scratch. Dorothy returned to Los Angeles in mid-April during a break in production. When they next visited the mansion, Spider was even more inattentive to her than usual. He spent most of his time hitting on other women guests. Dorothy sat quietly in a corner, talking with friends. She found reasons to visit Bogdanovich at his Bel Air home, telling Spider that Peter was helping her with her part in the picture. I'm sure he was. Luann noticed that Dorothy didn't confide in her anymore. Probably because she was afraid Luann would run to Chip and Chip would tell Spider. Seems legit. On the way to exercise class one morning, Luann noticed that Dorothy had taken up smoking again. She scolded her for it. "I don't know what to do about Spider," Dorothy replied forlornly. "I wake up in the morning and I'm just so unhappy. He makes me so nervous. I need a cigarette to calm down. It's all I have." At home, Spider had become a tyrant, even more of a tyrant. He sounds like he was always a tyrant. When Dorothy suggested the possibility of separation, he threatened her with an echo of her father's abandonment. "Once you walk out that door," he ranted, "you can never come back." Luann heard the threat. It made her angry. "You treat your women just like you'd treat a horse," she said. "Well," Spider replied defensively, "if that keeps her in line." At the end of the month, Hefner introduced Dorothy Stratten as the 1980 Playmate of the Year at a press luncheon in her honor. A tent was erected on the mansion lawn to handle the crowd. Art Buchwald flew in from Washington to MC, and the Washington Post reporter was once again on hand. Dorothy, breathtakingly beautiful in a gold gown, stood at Hef's side, trembling in anticipation. He put an arm around her in reassurance. Buchwald convulsed the crowd with a fanciful explanation of how the Playmate of the Year was chosen, and then Hefner introduced Dorothy. "She is something quite special," he said. He told about her first flight from Vancouver and her promising acting career. He mentioned the $200,000 in cash and mostly prizes she would be receiving as Playmate of the Year and handed her a check for $25,000. "For you, Dorothy," he said, "with a great deal of love." Dorothy thanked Mario Caselli, Marilyn Grabowski, Elizabeth Norris, Mickey Garcia of Playmate Promotions, and Hef for their friendship and for helping to make so many of my dreams come true. "I'm sure I must be the happiest girl in the world today," she said, beaming. Dorothy responded easily to the reporter's questions and posed for photographs on the stage. Spider stood at the bar at the rear of the tent, drink in hand, and glaring into the distance. Sorry, I'm getting too hot. Ow! Oh, God. I used to bite my nails all the time, and I stopped doing that fairly recently, and I'm really proud of myself, but I'm not used to having long fingernails all the time yet, and I frequently do that. Yowzer. The reporter from the Washington Post remarked on how polished a performer Dorothy had become since the Playmate reunion last September, when her every word had been the result of Spider's prompting. After the luncheon, Dorothy was scheduled to tape a guest appearance on The Tonight Show. Spider followed with his own entourage, but Dorothy barred him and his pals from her dressing room. With poise and good humor, she described her Playmate of the Year gifts to Johnny Carson. Her $13,000 brass-lined rosewood bathtub seated 10 people, she said. Carson winked in quick response. "What are we going to tell the other 8? For the next 2 weeks, Dorothy toured Canada again with Elizabeth Norris. As Canada's first Playmate of the Year, okay, actually, I'm going to say something about that Johnny Carson interview. I don't know why they don't mention on here that was actually another really good example of Dorothy's media savvy and like how to handle crowds and people, because Johnny Carson said something to her like, "Oh, what is something on a man you notice?" And she felt at that moment that he was trying to tease her in an unappreciated way, and she turned the tables on him by saying, he said, "Oh, what do you notice about a man?" And she looked at him and she kind of did the up down and said, "Stand up." And she made him the object to be like viewed and examined like a rotisserie chicken for a minute. And it was just very well handled and very clever. And considering how young she was and how inexperienced still, I think it was a brilliant little glimmer and glimpse into what she really could have become. So they didn't really mention that on here, but that was very clever of her. For the next 2 weeks, Dorothy toured Canada again with Elizabeth Norris. As Canada's first Playmate of the Year, she was a major celebrity there. Elizabeth noticed the new polish in both her appearance and her performance, but she also realized that Dorothy was working under terrific stress. Spider called constantly. Elizabeth heard her sobbing in her room long after midnight. A few days into the tour, Dorothy decided to write Spider a letter. She let Elizabeth read what she had written and then sent it off by courier. "I want to be free," the letter said. "Let the bird fly. If you love me, you'll let me go. If what we had was right, I'll come back." I almost guarantee these are words that Spider had put into Dorothy's head and lexicon. It reminds me very much of what he was saying when she was dating Craig and he wanted her to date him. Funny, you don't like your own rules being used against you. Almost like you weren't sincere about it. Ugh. Why? And then the agony of waiting for a reply. Sitting through interviews, meeting the public, appearing on talk shows, smiling all the while, Elizabeth noticed with admiration. Spider called in a rage, freaked out, threatening, but he caught himself mid-sentence, thought better of it, and hung up. 10 minutes later, when he called back, he sounded calm. Elizabeth knew there was someone else in Dorothy's life. She didn't know who. In the middle of the tour, Dorothy begged the weekend off to go to New York. She came back Sunday night, hopping happily down the hall, carrying her own luggage, kicking the hotel room door. "Elizabeth, I'm home." She went in, set down her bags, stood at the foot of the bed, deliriously fell backwards, feet flying. "Oh, Elizabeth," she said, "I had such a wonderful time." The phone rang. Elizabeth answered. New York was on the line. "I don't know who you are," Elizabeth said, "but thank you for making Dorothy so happy." It was Petey, calling to make certain that Dorothy had returned to Toronto safely. The Canadian tour was once again scheduled to end in Vancouver. The timing had been arranged to get Dorothy home for her mother's wedding. Nellie was marrying a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken master mechanic named Burl Eldridge. Burl restored classic automobiles for a living. He admired Nellie from a distance for weeks and finally asked her out. A month after they started dating, he proposed. Spider announced he was going to Vancouver for the wedding, though he hadn't been invited. Dorothy reluctantly agreed to meet him there. She told Elizabeth that the meeting worried her. She seemed afraid of Spider. Elizabeth offered to arrange for a bodyguard. The offer surprised Dorothy. "I can handle Spider by myself," she said. Women, please don't believe the Marvel movies. Those are literally fantasy. You are not the physical equal of a man. Even a small man. Ugh. In a fight, I mean. Spider barged in on Nellie's day on her wedding reception and disrupted the day. When he wasn't following Dorothy around the house arguing, he was on the phone setting up promotions for her with club owners he knew. Everyone at the reception wanted Dorothy's autograph and to have her picture taken with her. Dorothy's brother John tended bar. Her sister Louise sat on their new father's lap. Spider tried to tell Burl how to open a bottle of wine. Eldridge knew his way around fine cars and their wealthy owners. He'd been a big game hunter in Africa, and he didn't need advice from Spider. "I was opening these things before you were born," he told Spider, who then disappeared into the kitchen. Fine. There was something furtive about him, Burl thought. He never looked you straight in the eye. Spider dragged Dorothy off to her suite at the Four Seasons Hotel and ranted and raved at her most of the night. "He was so mean, Mom," Dorothy told her mother afterwards. "So mean." Spider insisted that Dorothy remain in Vancouver for several more days. He had his own plans for promoting her. Despite her strenuous 2-week tour of Canada for the magazine, he ordered her to make an appearance at nightclubs along Hornby Street. He charged the club orders for each appearance and pocketed the fees. Dorothy returned to New York, to Peter, and to the filming of They All Laughed. She was still undecided about whether or not to end her marriage. She wanted a separation, she was sure of that, but she also wanted to be fair to Spider, and Spider still insisted that she owed him. On a rainy Manhattan morning early in June, she wrote to Nellie and Burl about the confusion she felt. Thank you very much for all your concern and advice, but as you know, my problem goes much deeper than money, and as you also know, I don't intend to use money as an excuse. Everyone needs money to live, but I won't decide about my marriage on that basis. All I want is to be happy, no matter how rich or poor, and if it makes me happy to give him everything away for my freedom, then that's what I'll do. Throughout the month, Paul found it increasingly difficult to reach Dorothy on the phone. He had all her calls screened and now spent less time at the Wyndham and more time with Peter at the plaza. By the end of June, she'd made up her mind. She sent Spider a letter declaring their physical and financial separation. Spider had several responses to the separation. He cleaned out their joint bank account, buying some $1,500 worth of new clothes and the gear he needed to install Dorothy's Playmate of the Year stereo equipment in his living room. He called an old girlfriend in Vancouver and talked her into coming down for a few days to console him. And he went to see a divorce lawyer, J. Michael Kelly, who took him as a client and introduced him to a private detective named Mark L. Goldstein. Goldstein was eager to help Spider to get the goods on Dorothy and Bogdanovich. Since Spider considered himself Dorothy's personal manager, he believed that he might have grounds for a suit against Bogdanovich for encouraging Dorothy to leave him. Goldstein's job was to build a case. Okay, you've probably noticed sometimes I mess up when I say Vancouver. I don't know why I keep saying Vancouver. I don't know why suddenly I turn into a Brit. What's wrong with me? Mark Goldstein was the son of a Beverly Hills psychologist. He wanted to be a lawyer and he started practicing early. Yeah, we don't really need to talk about him so much. He was refused admittance to the California bar on the grounds of moral disqualification. So basically he was a total loser, and some of the loser things he gets up to we'll just skip over in this story because we don't need to be dirtying up Dorothy's beautiful story with all of these extraneous losers all over town. Of course, Goldstein and Spider hit it off immediately. Spider went to see Bob Houston about financial arrangements. Dorothy had instructed Houston to pay Spider's rent and other living expenses. She also agreed to several lump sum payments, including one to repay a loan Spider had received from his mother. Dorothy's going to pay all your bills, Bob told Spider, plus a cash settlement. Under California law, you're entitled to half of everything earned to date. What could be fairer than that? After taxes, Houston calculated, that would come to about $40,000. Enough, in his estimation, for a healthy young man to buy himself a new start. Spider had other ideas. He was thinking about alimony, maybe 50% of Dorothy's gross income for the next 3 years. That's not realistic, Houston said. You've taken enough from this woman. You are not going to extort anymore. But Spider wasn't listening. He collected more than $5,000 in cash advances in the month of July, but he told Chip Clark that Dorothy had cut him off. Dorothy and Peter kept their relationship quiet in New York. The New York press missed the story entirely. Each had occasion to call Hefner during the production, but neither mentioned it to him. Dorothy called to ask Hefner's advice. Peter had suggested she switch agents and sign with William Morris, a major talent agency. Hefner thought she ought to wait until her return to LA when they could discuss the change at length. Peter called to tell Hefner how well Dorothy was doing in the picture. He'd given her additional lines, he said, and added a roller skating sequence. He was enthusiastic about her performance, but he neglected to add that they had fallen in love. New York Village Voice reporter Teresa Carpenter discovered later that not even the production crew really noticed the romance until near the end of the shooting. Then Peter and Dorothy began to come to work holding hands. One day, Bogdanovich walked over to the couch where Dorothy sat chewing gum, Carpenter would write. You shouldn't chew gum, he admonished. It has sugar in it. Dorothy playfully removed the wad from her mouth and deposited it in his palm. Doesn't that remind us a little bit of our friend Snively Spider? Telling Dorothy what to do and what not to do. Controlling the way she dresses and looks and acts. By that time, Bogdanovich had affectionately begun calling her Dr. for Dorothy Ruth. She in turn had begun calling him PB, which is an ugly nickname, but sure. Dorothy's role in They All Laughed isn't a big one, but as Carpenter wrote in The Village Voice, Dorothy, by all accounts, emerges as a shimmering seraph, a vision in perfect clad perennially in white. In one scene, she is found sitting in the Algonquin Hotel, bathed in a diaphanous light. It was one of those scenes that could make a career, recalled the member of the crew. People in the screen room wrestled when they saw her. That's also the picture that PDB put on the cover of the Killing of the Unicorn. The film wrapped in mid-July. Petey flew with Dorothy to London on the Concorde for a short vacation. They registered at the Dorchester Hotel under assumed names. He bought her a new wardrobe. Did he? And proceeded to show her the town. Spider had always found time for other women. At a mansion party the previous summer, a startled guest had come upon him in the lounge chair by the pool, screwing someone else's date. Now Chip noticed that he was seeing several different girls. They all had sympathetic, comforting natures. Spider would spend the whole evening talking about Dorothy, and the girls would console him. One regular overnight guest was a student at Loyola Marymount named Lynn Hayes. Loyola Marymount. Is that where Holly Madison went? I feel like. Anyway, Spider had picked her up in the Max Disco in Beverly Hills. Lynn took Spider's obsession with Dorothy personally. It made her jealous. When Spider talked about Dorothy, she got mad. For his part, Spider directed his detective friend Goldstein to look into Lynn's family assets. Oh my god. Spider asked Chip if he'd like to move into the spare bedroom. He could use the money, he said, so he wanted to sublease it. Chip wasn't interested, so Spider offered the room to Patty Lowerman, who lived way out in Riverside. He'd met Patty at an auto show in November 1979 and was grooming her to be a second Dorothy Stratten. A young, blonde checkout girl who modeled on the side, Patty was no Dorothy. She had tried to interest Casilli in photographing her for Playboy, but he had declined because, at 17, she was still under the age of consent. Patty agreed to take the room and moved in with her waterbed, her clothes, and her record collection. How very 70s of her. Spider's moods grew darker in the last days of July, alternating between anger and despair. He plotted with Goldstein, but with others he was increasingly despondent. The doctor who shared the house found him sitting alone in the living room one evening, trying to compose a letter to Dorothy. "This is really hard," he said. He started to cry. Spider felt Dorothy might be so cut off from him by her lawyers and Bogdanovich that he would never see her again. He called their former roommate early one morning, crying, and asked her to intercede for him with Dorothy. "I've lost her mind," he said. "She won't listen to me anymore. You're her best friend. You've got to talk to her. We've got to get her back in tune with me again." Molly had no intention of helping Spider. She was pleased that Dorothy might be finally free of him. He talked about killing himself, and the young actress thought he sounded spaced out. He told her to come over. He wanted to talk, but she refused. She was too afraid of him to consider being alone with him. And she was also too afraid of him. She was also too smart for him. She was too smart to allow herself to be left alone in a room with that dangerous man. We need to use the proper terms. They are important. Dorothy and Peter quietly returned from London to Peter's home in Bel Air in late July. The night Spider learned that Dorothy was back, he drove to Bel Air in the Mercedes with a .38 caliber police special Chip had lent him. "I need it for protection," he said. Why Chip would loan that dude a gun when he knows he's fixing to murder his girlfriend is anyone's business, or is anyone's guess. What the hell, man? He sat outside Bogdanovich's front gates for 2 hours with the weapon. Then he drove up to the hills above Bel Air, parked, and thought about killing himself. Sadly, he chose not to. He fired the revolver twice before he drove home. Dorothy had never been happier or busier, though she had a nagging concern about Spider. She flew to Houston and Dallas on a 3-day promotion the first week in August. She had been approached to play Marilyn Monroe in Lawrence Schiller's TV movie about the famous actress, but was still working on the Bogdanovich film. She was scheduled to meet with producer Marty Krofft to discuss a major role in the new film The Last Desperado, starring Bruce Dern. With Peter's help, she found an apartment in Beverly Hills. They invited Louise to come to LA for a visit the following week. In Houston, Dorothy threw out the first ball at the Astros game. She wanted to work out a final separation from Spider, and she felt a strong sense of responsibility about doing it herself. She called him from Houston and agreed to have lunch with him on Friday, August 8th. "The Queen is coming back," he boasted at dinner with friends Thursday night. Patty cleaned the house for Dorothy's visit. Spider bought champagne and red roses. He put on the 3-piece fawn suit he'd worn at their wedding. He predicted she would wear something dressy to their meeting. She arrived in casual clothes, and the reunion went downhill from there. Dorothy didn't read the card on the roses and barely sipped the champagne. They went out for lunch. She patiently explained to him that their relationship had run its course. She was serious about a separation and wanted to proceed with a settlement. When Patty Lauerman returned to the house, she found Spider and Dorothy talking, smiling and talking. At first, Patty thought they'd reconciled. "Should I leave?" Patty asked. "Nah, she's leaving," Spider said dejectedly. The telephone rang. It was Bogdanovich's secretary, Linda Ewing. Dorothy spoke to her briefly, then chatted with Patty and went through her clothes. She took some and left the rest for Patty. After Dorothy left, Linda called again to make sure she had gone. "I couldn't get through to her," Spider told Patty. "Bogdanovich has got her in the palm of his hand. Nothing I say sinks in anymore." Spider's girlfriend, Lynn Hayes, refused to go to the house that day after his meeting with Dorothy. She was jealous and angry. Spider never bought her champagne or roses. When they went to the beach or roller skating, he asked her to pay for the hot dogs. Dump him! Dump him! Don't date losers. Don't be jealous of losers. Dump them. Good Lord. Everyone in this entire story is completely insane. Friday evening, Chip and Luann dropped by Spider's house to pick up Chip's .38. Chip was moving back to Florida and wanted Luann to have the gun for protection, he said. Spider went to get the gun, walked outside with Patty, raised it over his head, and fired it, laughing strangely. Noise from the freeway masked the sound. Sitting in the living room upstairs with Luann and Goldstein, Chip thought he heard a shot. "Are you shooting down there?" he called. "No, that was a backfire on the freeway," said Spider. When Spider handed him the gun, Chip checked the cylinder and found that not just 1 but 3 shots had been fired. He asked Spider about it in private. "I sat out in my car the other night and thought about straightening things out my way," Spider said. "It's a sobering experience to sit there and really contemplate the end." Spider told one of the women in his life something more, that he'd thought about killing Dorothy and then himself. So he's going around telling people. People should have known. Like, coulda, woulda, shoulda. Nobody can really see these things. And I'm sure a lot of people thought, like, oh, he's just being crazy. He's being crazy. Or maybe I'm being crazy. Maybe I'm misinterpreting things. But no, when you hear the still small voice, you listen to that bastard. He's telling you the truth. I think it's better to overreact a little bit to those kinds of things than to underreact, particularly as a woman. Or particularly if you want to be a good guy. Isn't the whole point of being a man that you're going to protect women? Like, this is so hilarious how that never happens. I am so mean again today. Why am I so cranky, you guys? I don't know. I'm going to get over it. Maybe it's the story. This story makes me a little cranky, perhaps. Sorry. Okay, we're going to keep it not super down. On Sunday the 10th, he wanted a party. He gave Patty a list of 20 names. He had strawberry daiquiris, a barbecue chicken, a tossed salad, rolls, jello, and jug wine. Fewer than half the people Patty called showed up. Dorothy was supposed to call him to confirm a meeting on Thursday to talk about the settlement. When he didn't hear from her, he was furious. Dorothy had gone with Louise to the desert northeast of LA for a sunglasses promotion shooting for Optal. She would be there for 2 days. She called Spider on Monday from her motel and agreed to see him at the house on Thursday after the morning meeting with Bob Houston. Then she and Louise called Nellie. Dorothy told her mother about the lunch with Paul 3 days before. His eyes looked so sad, Mum, she said. It worried Nellie. She thought Spider was being too quiet. It wasn't like him. Don't go and see him again, she advised her daughter. It's dangerous. Oh, Mom, Dorothy said. What could he do? He could hurt you, Nellie warned. I saw in another article she added to that, he could cut your face. And a lot of guys have and will do that kind of stuff. Also, I have to kind of change my tune on Dorothy's mom. I was thinking a lot about the stuff that was written in the beginning of this article about the beginning of her life and how emotionally and in many other ways stunted she was from her childhood growing up in a orphanage. And I was thinking a lot more about her motivations and things. I think in previous videos I've made about Dorothy Stratten, I referred to Nellie as Dorothy's useless mother. And I am frustrated in many ways with some of the decisions that her mom made. But I think perhaps that was being overly harsh of me. I think that she probably did her best and she didn't always make the perfect decision, like going to Holland while her drop-dead beautiful 17-year-old daughter is dating a guy who she hates. You just left them alone for 3 months. But on the other hand, I think that she was like Dorothy and a little too naive and a little too trusting. And of all the flaws to have in the world, like those are probably not the worst ones. So I need to watch my mouth a little bit when I talk about Dorothy's mom. Also, I think I'm projecting a little bit because of my own lovely relationship with my own mom, who is named, guess what? Nellie. So perhaps that has something to do with it. I'm going to be nicer about Nellie from now on. Okay. On Tuesday evening, Bogdanovich dropped in on the Hefner mansion. It was the first time they had seen each other in months. They sat together on a couch in the living room. Peter didn't stay seated. He kept jumping up as he spoke of Dorothy in the picture, but he sounds like Tom Cruise. She's wonderful in it, he said, pacing about. You're going to be very proud of her. I already am, Hefner replied. Peter then told Hefner about his relationship with Dorothy. Hefner chided him for their secrecy. We're trying to keep a low profile until after the film is released, Peter said. I don't want Dorothy to go through what Sybil and I did in the press. I hope this isn't a casual affair, Hefner said. Dorothy deserves better than that. Peter grew serious, shaking his head. I'm in love, he said, and I mean really in love. I never felt this way about anyone before in my life. Marilyn Grabowski took Dorothy and Louise to lunch at Le Dome on Wednesday, August 13th. The French menu confused Louise, and Dorothy helped her young sister to order. Louise finally decided she wanted a hamburger. Marilyn couldn't get over how good Dorothy looked. She was always lovely, but at lunch that afternoon she was luminous. Marilyn asked about her London holiday and commented on how happy she seemed. Dorothy nodded and then actually blushed. She had been pleased with the layout she'd been shown for her Hollywood Blondes pictorial. They discussed her schedule for the rest of the week. She was meeting with Bob Houston on Thursday morning. On Friday, she was to see Marty Krofft to talk about the part in The Last Desperado. She had a good chance at it. She was also scheduled to appear on The Merv Griffin Show. Over dessert, Marilyn asked about Spider. Dorothy said she thought they could work things out and remain friends. She didn't mention that she planned to see him the next day. That same day, Spider met with his lawyer, J. Michael Kelly, and talked about a house he wanted Dorothy to buy with him in North Hollywood as an investment for like $200,000. A little later, he called Houston. "You're meeting with Dorothy tomorrow," he said. "Ask her about the house." Houston hadn't heard anything about the house. He thought Spider might be making it up for something. So he decided not to talk about houses with Dorothy unless she brought the subject up. "Sometimes a playmate dies," Spider told Bill and Susan LaChasse at their studio Wednesday night. He'd stopped by to look at publicity photographs of Patty. The LaChasses had been Spider's partners in crime for the ill-fated Dorothy Stratten poster project. Actually, I wish they would have done that. I really love those roller skating pictures that LaChasses took of her. But of course, guess who thought it made her look like cheap and tawdry, I think he said. Peter Bogdanovich. He's so nice. Now in a strangely jovial mood, he mentioned Claudia Jennings, 1970 Playmate of the Year, whose career as an actress had been cut short by a fatal car accident the previous fall. "Some playmates get killed," he said. "Some actresses die before their films come out. When that happens, it causes a lot of trouble." So I want to say they 100% should have seen this coming. Someone should have done something, but then also, like, what could they have really done? Everyone told Dorothy to stay away from this guy. She didn't listen. They could have gone to the police and reported, something, but I think we all know that the police would have done exactly jack shit. So, man, what anyone could have done at this point, I don't know, except for Dorothy. Ugh, but she was just being nice. She didn't do anything wrong. So frustrating. His comments were curiously inconsistent with his jocular manner, Bill thought. Spider told the LaChasses he had bought a shotgun. "I'm going to take up hunting," he said with a smirk. Patty went home from her first acting lesson to find Spider standing alone in the kitchen staring into space. Later, with Lynn, they watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was one of Dorothy's favorite films. Thursday, August 14th, 1980. At breakfast, Spider made a list of points he meant to raise with Dorothy. In addition to a cash settlement, he wanted an income. He wanted her help in obtaining work permit. She could have a legal separation, but he didn't want a divorce. Patty vacuumed. Lynn watched television. Bogdanovich had found out that Goldstein was following Dorothy. It infuriated him. She decided that it would be better not to tell him she was meeting with Spider. She asked Louise if she wanted to go along. Louise said no, she'd rather stay at Peter's with his 2 daughters. Dorothy asked her sister not to mention to anyone where she was going, and then left for her 10 o'clock appointment with Bob Houston. Dorothy and her business manager met in his conference room. They discussed the possibility of getting her a new agent. Her lawyer had suggested William Morris or creative artists. Houston gave her a box of checks for her new bank account and had her fill out an application for an American Express card. She asked about buying a car. Spider had sold the Jaguar and a few of the other gifts she'd received as Playmate of the Year. He wouldn't give up their Mercedes, and the 1967 Cougar she'd been driving was falling apart. She wondered if she could afford a used Fiat. "You don't want to drive a second-hand car," Houston said. "Let me arrange to lease a new BMW or an Alfa Romeo." "Can I really afford that?" she asked. "Yes." She smiled. "But what if I have to give all the money to Spider?" she asked, the smile fading. "You won't have to give all the money to Spider," Bob assured her. He reminded her that the part she would be meeting Marty Krofft for in the next role to discuss was a $100,000 leading role. "Just don't worry so much," he said. "You're going to do fine." Spider called. Houston took the call in his office, and Spider was cloying. "How are you today, Bob? Dorothy's there, huh? Oh, good. How are things looking? You talked to her about the house yet?" Bob told him they hadn't talked about the house yet. "Okay," Spider said. "Well, when do you think Dorothy will be leaving there? Half an hour or so? Why don't you have her give me a call before she leaves?" Back in the conference room, Bob told Dorothy about the call. She said that she'd agreed to meet with Spider again because he was being nice about everything and she wanted to keep it that way. "There's really no need for you to go see him," Bob said. "It's none of my business, but you don't have to put yourself through that. It's at that stage where the lawyers should be doing the talking." "It's better this way," Dorothy said. "I want a divorce, and I don't think that Spider can handle it yet." She wanted to proceed with the property settlement and the separation now and the divorce later. She was convinced that everything would be easier if she met him and talked with him in person. "I'd like to remain his friend," she told Houston. Dorothy called Spider to say that she was on her way and then left. Spider called Houston again about 5 minutes later. "Hey," he said, "I understand she's on the way. Did you get to talk about the house?" Bob said, "No, we didn't talk about the house. We talked about a settlement, and the property settlement." "Oh, good," Spider said. "Okay, nice talking to you," and he hung up. Okay, I think I'm actually going to end it there. Because that's the end of that chapter. Actually, no, I'm just going to keep going for 5 minutes because, we only got 5 minutes left on there. Okay. Where's the end of this chapter? Okay. Spider was alone in the house when Dorothy arrived shortly after 12 noon. Patty and Lynn had left at 11 to go roller skating in Venice, and Spider had agreed to meet them at 2. Goldstein had called. Spider had called Spider from a telephone in his Mercedes to make sure that everything was all right. "Dorothy's here and everything's fine," Spider told him. Sometime earlier, Spider and Goldstein had discussed wiring Spider for sound so that they could tape the meeting. Mark had suggested that Spider get Dorothy to say something about taking care of him, something they could use in a claim for financial support. Spider told Goldstein he liked the idea because he thought Thursday would be his last meeting with her. They gave up on the plan when they couldn't assemble the necessary gear. What a bunch of idiots. Lynn and Patty called the house around 2 o'clock. No one answered. They called several more times during the afternoon. Goldstein began calling about 2:30. No response. Nellie phoned Louise from Vancouver that afternoon. She asked to talk to Dorothy. Remembering her sister's instructions, Louise said, "She's downstairs at the pool, Mum. She's swimming. She can't come to the phone." Lynn and Patty returned from skating at 5 p.m. and noticed the 2 cars outside the house, Dorothy's Galaxina Cougar and Paul's Star 80 Mercedes. The door in the downstairs bedroom was closed. They assumed Spider and Dorothy wanted to be alone and went upstairs. They found Dorothy's purse in the upstairs living room. They watched the evening news. Spider's phone rang and kept on ringing, and no one answered it. At 6:30, the 2 girls went off to have dinner together. Steve Kushner, the doctor and housemate, came home an hour later and also noticed the closed door as he went upstairs. The ringing bedroom phone bothered him as it had bothered the girls. His German Shepherd seemed restless in the backyard. At 8 that evening, Lynn dropped Patty back at the house. "Call me as soon as they come out," Lynn said. "I want to know everything that happened." Lynn drove angrily to her family home in the Canoga part, jealous that, Lynn's the girlfriend, that's right, jealous that Spider was still with Dorothy. Patty and Steve watched the television together in the living room upstairs and listened to the intermittent ringing of the phone. Goldstein called Kushner from his car a little after 11. "You better go down and take a look while I wait on the phone," he said. Patty was afraid to go. Kushner went down alone. He knocked and there was no response. He opened the door and saw 2 bodies and an arc of blood across the wall and ceiling. He closed the door again. He was a doctor, and he knew the look of death. The police weren't notified until 12:15 a.m. They arrived at 12:20. By then, Goldstein was there, busy with Dorothy's address book. When Lieutenant Glenn Ackerman came to the scene soon after, he decided he was dealing with a murder-suicide, a conclusion confirmed by further investigation and the coroner's report. The clothes were strewn across the floor at one side of the bed, and Spider's body lay near the door, face down on top of a shotgun in a pool of blood. On a table next to the bed was a 5-page letter from Spider from Lynn, complaining about his brooding obsession with Dorothy and his daily exploitation of Patty as domestic help. Hefner was playing pinball with a few friends in the game room when the phone rang that night. His secretary, Sis Rundle, said that a man named Mark Goldstein wanted to talk to him on a matter of some urgency. Hefner didn't know anyone named Mark Goldstein and suggested she take a message. A few minutes later, she walked back in. "I think you'd better talk to him, Hef," she said. "It sounds important." "I'm sorry to disturb you at this time of night," the curiously solicitous stranger said. "My name is Mark Goldstein, and I thought you ought to be the first to know. Spider and Dorothy have been killed." Hefner was stunned. The color drained from his face. He grew ashen. All activity in the game house ceased as the awareness spread among his friends that something terrible had occurred. Whew, okay, that is another 45 minutes. Dang, this is a long article, but it's really in depth, and I'm really appreciative of all the information. So, a little bit heavy, kind of keeping me down a little bit. Maybe we'll do some kind of 50s Playboy review next time, because those are always so chipper and happy, and I love them. So, thanks for going with me on this journey, and I will be back very soon with the probable last part of the Dorothy Stratten story from the May 1981 Playboy magazine. Thanks very much. Don't do anything I wouldn't do.